Just as a place to begin, why do you think the ancients went to such trouble to build these monuments?
Well, as I was saying in my talk, but one of the things that it's very hard for us to understand, I mean, apart from the time that separates us from these ancient cultures, is to get into the mindset of an ancient culture. I mean, we have to imagine a world without cities, without roads, without anything. And I mean, at the end of the day, they were human beings like us. I mean, there's a famous saying that I picked up from an astronomer. You know, there were Einsteins, there were Newtons, there were intelligent people then. We know that they had the same capacity as us, they had the same brain capacity. The difference is that they didn't have the science we have. We are quickly externalizing. I mean, the minute you're ready for school, you're told that there is physics and geometry and mathematics and geography, and you quickly know that the Earth is a globe and so forth. So the difference there is this desire to understand without the information, and therefore they employed a different method. They imploded rather than exploded. They looked for the answers by trying to figure out what they could sense by observation. And this desire led them to try and somehow explain their existence. Now, one of the things that we don't do, but they did quite a lot, is observe the sky. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, we have evidence throughout the whole ancient cultures. I mean, from Egyptians to Mayans to Chinese. The sky was something that they were constantly observing, particularly primitive people. They were under the sky. I was talking about the desert when I gave the conference. You know, just being a couple of days in the desert already pushes you to look at the celestial landscape. You just can't help it. It's there, and you're under it. You're observing it. And I'm talking of just a few days. I mean, a lifetime there would really get you into this mood of looking at the cosmos, trying to understand it. And what they saw, which is very obvious, certainly with the Egyptian culture, they saw a beautiful, orderly machine there, sort of moving in majestic timing, which we now know is in the split-second accuracy. And this order that was there kind of matched the order on the ground, the cycles of the seasons, the life and death cycles, the changes in climatic conditions, and they began to sense that there is a relationship, which there is. What we know today is that the reason all this is happening is because we live on a globe, and this globe has several motions. I mean, the ones that most of us know is the rotation of the Earth on its axis, and we get the effects of night and day. The sun revolves around the Earth revolves around the sun, and we get the effects of the seasons, and of course the less known precessional motion, the slight wobble that takes about 26,000 years. Because this machine does this, we're here. You know, these motions have produced this planet the way it is. Now we know this. The ancients did not, and this wrong in a sense conclusion, but right in the sense of observation, is that for them it was the sky that moved, not us. And somehow this order was so inspiring that they wanted to link themselves to it. They wanted to join it. They almost sensed that they belonged to it, which in a sense cosmologically it's not wrong. We are from that cosmos. And this desire to do this began with attempts to point out where these celestial objects would rise and set, and slowly began to mature into a complex way of thinking. It's the beginning of, I mean, the megalithic phase, if you like, is the beginning of this. Ended up in pyramids, and now we're ending up with people putting people on the moon and planning visits to Mars and so forth. So it's this desire to know and link yourself to it. I think this is, but for us it's very difficult to understand why they went to this whole trouble of moving stones and massive stones. It's very hard to get into that frame of mind, but for them it was almost a sacred mission. They had to somehow create a link between sky and ground.
A means of discovering their own identity, in a way.
I think, and I'm talking in those terms these days, we're entering the metaphysical way of thinking. I think that they managed, in their own way, because they were forced to, they managed to tap into, not so much through what we would consider as being science, but through just a sense of knowing. They were capable, because they use their senses in a much more pronounced way than we do. We have the same senses, we can see, but our sense of observation has been diminished because we're literally offered everything on a silver plate. Whereas because of this huge capacity to observe and to exploit the senses, they were very sensitive to noises and sounds and changes, that they were able to tap somehow into the sensation that they belonged into a cosmic environment. They truly felt cosmological.
And also we see in many ancient cultures, in the Egyptians, in the Mesoamericans, if rumours are to be believed, we know a little of it at the moment, the Chinese cultures, that their study of the heavens was very precise, very methodical, very thorough, and at least some of these cultures understood, something as complex as precession quite well.
Well, as you know, I mean, still the status quo among scholars is that the ancients did not know precession, and nor did they observe it. As we stand today in our understanding of historical science, precession was discovered by the Greeks in the 1st century, and that's it. But it's very, very obvious, and now more and more archaeoastronomers are getting into this, that certainly the ancient Egyptians were aware of precession. And now we have evidence of a primitive society, as I gave the talk, in the Sahara, that not only aligned monuments to stars, and very specifically, by the way, the alignments are very precise, that they actually track the motions. So we see lines changing position and literally tracking the stars over several centuries.
Indeed, it's a very long job, isn't it? I mean,
well, it takes quite a lot of time to realize the motion and then to track it. And they left us physical evidence. I mean, we actually can work it out. We can date what they were doing using precession calculations. I wouldn't be surprised if there was the impression we're getting now, because of so many megalithic sites being found everywhere in Egypt, here in the UK, Spain, for example. I mean, I've been visiting some megalithic sites. I didn't even know were there. What's very obvious to me, anyway, is that there seems to have been a megalithic culture, probably a global megalithic culture, or at least in the old world, and somehow they communicated. For example, one of the big surprises of exploring the Sahara is that we did find human remains.
You found human remains?
Yes, we did.
Which were
near the Nabta Playa site.
Which you were able to date, presumably?
We were able to date it. They're about 6,000 BC approximately. But the funny thing about these human remains is that the majority are from sub-Saharan racial origins. They were black Africans.
Yeah.
But, and here's the surprise, we found Mediterranean bones. That morphology indicates Mediterranean cultures, races. Now, how the hell Mediterranean people got 1,000 kilometers away from the Mediterranean into the deep Sahara is a big question.
That's a long way.
So that indicates to me what we had long suspected, because we see all along the Mediterranean belt, from Tenerife all the way to Malta, there's megalithic sites all over the place. And they all seem to be doing two things: moving large stones and aligning to celestial objects.
Well, the two questions that leap to mind immediately then is why and how?
Well, if you want to stay on the practical side rather than looking at the metaphysical side, one of the things that occurs to you in the desert or on the open sea, but well, my thing is the desert, is how do you know where you are?
Yeah.
And now we know because we have GPSs and we kind of satellite. These were primitive GPSs. In a sense, if you have if you mark a spot and you mark a position of sunrise and you mark a position or an altitude of a star or a rising point of a star, you know the latitude. Now, if you use that circle to also mark calendrical, then you know the time that the star is observed, hence you can work out the longitude. And we know that the ancient, even modern Bedouins do this. They do it almost instinctively. So I have this strange feeling that these were kind of perhaps sacred spots, but they also indicated to the travelers where they were. I mean, if you were in Stonehenge, you knew you were at that latitude.
Yes.
I mean, that's how we navigated. I mean,
that
now
makes a great deal of sense.
we tend to forget this because we now use instruments, and we tend to forget that these instruments are merely reproducing what is happening in the sky.
I noticed that there was one of the photographs in your talk of Benini was his. I didn't catch the guy, the Arab explorer's name.
Hassan and Bey.
Thank you, Hassan
Yeah,
and Bey. There's a
yeah.
photograph of him with a theodolite,
That's
is it
right.
not?
Yeah.
And that's obviously a big clue, I think, is it not?
Well, there is a story about Hassan and Bey because when he went to explore these faraway regions, when he discovered the Waynat, he didn't have when he had a theodolite, his interest was not so much with the sky. He was trying to geographically mark these positions, which of course he had to use the longitudes and latitudes. But traveling in the desert now, because he was traveling around the month of April, and it's a good month, but it's very hard to travel during daytime. You can't walk that much.
Because it's just too hot.
It's too hot and you use too much water. So they would travel at sunset and perhaps throughout the night sometimes. Now that's the difficulty. If you try and move in the desert at night when there's no features, you just easily get lost. I mean, within minutes you're lost, unless you use the stars. And he was told by the Bedouin guides that they were actually using the stars. And he told them, how do you do it? And they were doing exactly what I'm saying. They were actually observing. They knew the constellations, so they would pick a star because they knew that that star would rise at a certain direction, and then they would replace that star as it started moving across the sky with another star that was in the same spot. So they knew which star would follow, and so they had a direction. But then he asked them, how do you know when to go? Because the problem with desert navigation is not so much to know where you're going, but you have to know when to get there at the right time. You have to get there when the well has water.
I see. Okay.
Everything depends on getting there at the right time. If you get too early, because they were looking for, in ancient times, they were looking for ponds that were left over by the monsoon. And you have to know when this water is going to be there. If you get there too early, it's not there. If you get there too late, it's gone.
Sure.
And you die. It's simple as that. I mean, if you miss the timing. So they began to work out the time by using the stars. And they would know which stars would rise so many hours after sunrise or after sunset. So the stars is the key, if you like, to these ancient cultures. The machinery of the sky is the impetus that led them to two things. What we're beginning to realize anthropologically, the paleoanthropologists begin to realize that two things influence ancient primitive man. One is the observation of the sky. It provides direction, it provides timing, therefore you develop slowly mathematics, geometry, and so on. All this springs from there. The other is climate, that they were literally forced to do certain things because the climate forced them. So as the desert, for example, became arid, they had to learn how to move great distances. So in a sense, these two factors molded them, forced them into developing. And because the stones were the things that they had around them, they used these stones, first small stones, which we see at Napsa, they're not particularly big. Mm-hmm. But gradually it became a more complex and more elaborate theology, if you like, and they started using large stone, and we end up with the pyramids.
I wanted to ask you about that because the stone circle that you showed in your talk, you reckon is dated to about 13,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago?
Yes. Sorry, ago, yes.
Yeah.
We have dates that range. It's difficult to date stones.
Of course.
All right.
Of course.
However, we can get a bit of a feel because of the erosion of the stones and so forth. I mean, they look pretty old. I mean, the stone circle I was showing of the Bagnall circle, it's very obvious that it's been lying there for a long time. So the geology can help us a bit, but where we can get more accurate, if by luck they align them to stars. Once we have that, and we know we can guess the star, then we can time it more accurately.
And you were talking about a solstice alignment for that particular group. I wanted to ask you, was that a solstice alignment as would have been the case in, 10,000 BC? Or as
The
it is
solstice
today?
alignment has been dated to about 6,000 BC,
Okay.
which takes us about 8,000 years from now.
Uh-huh.
I'm not so convinced by using the sun. It's known as the obliquity of the ecliptic.
Uh-huh.
In a cycle of 40,000 years, the tilt of the Earth changes about 2.5 degrees. So the sunrise position and sunset at solstices particularly would be slightly wider, if you like.
Yeah.
So if you have an accurate measurement, you can more or less get a rough date. But I think with stones it's rather difficult because the motion is very, very small. Whereas the stars have a much larger motion because of the precession effect. So for example, take a star, for example, like Sirius. We know the ancient Egyptians observed it when it was rising at approximately, let me say this, about 30 degrees south of east.
Okay.
Well, now it's about 17. So there's a large difference. I mean, a degree is kind of large. When we're talking about fractions of a degree, I think with stones, I'm not too convinced with this. So the stars is the trick. It's when we began to realize, for example, that pyramids were aligned to stars. So stars gave us a means to measure. You have, in a sense, you have a larger vernier scale, whereas the sun gives you a too narrow. But still, it can be used in certain sites. I know they're used in Stonehenge. What's it all about, really, is we're trying to change perception. We're trying to change something that truly is badly perceived. I mean, I'm utterly convinced that there is a misconception about Egyptology, that the Egyptians are far more sophisticated, that they have an older pedigree, which we're beginning to discover, and that they knew much more than we give them credit for in terms of astronomy, for example.
Do you think the chronology is right as it stands?
I think the chronology from the historical period, I think it's very accurate. I would contest that.
This is from the Pharaoh period.
I'm pretty convinced that the early dynastic period was about 3000 BC and moved. We have a bit of a slight doubt in the Old Kingdom. I mean, we give a plus or minus 200 years. We get more accurate as we get nearer.
And pre-dynastic?
Pre-dynastic is where we get lost. But it depends what you mean by pre-dynastic, because now we're realizing that the pre-dynastic phase, we're beginning to call it prehistoric phase, but was much, much older. I mean, we're having dates of 8,000, 9,000 BC. So there's a much older build-up. I'm very convinced of this. I think there is something to put in order here.
Yeah, yeah.
And we have a bad understanding about what we call prehistory. I think it's been sort of shunned a bit. I mean, there were people doing drawings in caves and they were hunting. Whereas we're beginning to realize they were far more sophisticated, much more attuned, for example, to their environment. One of the things that you sense when you go in these remote places where you see the remnants of prehistoric people, one of the things that struck me is the total, absolute, no markings at all. The landscape is totally untouched. It's virgin. And they simply did not do what we do.
But it clearly wasn't always that way, if the paintings are to be believed, the cave paintings.
Well, no, the climatic conditions are different.
Yeah.
There was fauna, but they don't do damage. There is no sign of damage, of broken rocks, of pits. They just didn't touch it. They seem to have so well adapted, and it's a fascinating thing because we hardly were able to stay there for 3 days. I mean, when you get there, we were running out of water. We had to return. I mean, they were there for thousands of years. To me, man who can live like this was much more attuned to living on this planet than we are.
Absolutely.
I mean, and that's the thing that is fascinating about this ancient culture, is that although we rank them as primitives, they were far more advanced in the sense of knowing how to live on this planet.
I wanted to touch on that because I felt that you barely scratched the surface with your talk. I could have listened to you for a lot longer. Yeah. But I sensed that where you were going with that was to say that here is a relatively primitive people who had a culture, developed it, and then went on to found pharaonic dynastic Egypt.
In a sense, they were forced to. Yeah.
But would your take be that they developed their culture, their science, if you like, from scratch, or did they inherit it from an older culture?
That's a good question. Well, we've traced them all the way back to the Chad. The route is very obvious. I don't know if you saw the map that I showed.
Chad in Central Africa?
Well, in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
We have no doubt, I mean, from genetics and anthropological work, that the root origins is East Africa. But what is new about this is that, of course, these people spread. In fact, surprisingly, they think it's a very small number that moved. They think about maybe 100 or so. So the whole human race springs from this 100 of people who spread around. Genetics have proved beyond any doubt that we trace the whole thing back to one point.
Indeed.
And we even date it. I mean, we think it's about 200,000 BC. The anthropological evidence is showing us this. So we know literally where we spring from.
Yeah.
What is the big mystery is what caused the shift from a primitive man, Homo erectus, to Homo sapien. But we know it happened. And there must have been one woman who kicked it off. We call her the African Eve. To think that from there, now, the latest I've heard is that they moved around 60,000 BC. So we're rather new, really. I mean, in terms of geological time. So about 60,000 BC, they started moving. Very clearly took the Levant road, crossed the Dardanelles, entered Europe, spread around, and ended up in the Americas. But what's now seems to be the case is that there seems to be one contingency, one small group that moved northwest and settled in the Sub-Sahara. We know because we find the rock art and all that. And when the conditions were correct climatically, they came down into the regions I was showing you. Probably stayed there for a few thousand years and then gradually moved towards the Nile. The Nile was still very uninhabitable. There was still very dramatic floods. It just was very dangerous to live there. We think there might have been people there, but probably hunter-gatherers, fishermen, very, very primitive. While these people in the Sahara were developing, looking at the stars, domesticating animals, navigating, and so they were kind of ready for civilization, if you like. And what caused it, in a sense, was that the desert became super arid, about 4,500 BC.
And prior to that, there had been some...
No, the desert was very fertile. I mean,
right.
we can see it from the drawings that they left us. And you saw yourself, they had cattle and paddocks, and they had houses. You know, they were very sophisticated people.
Is there any clue as to why it changed? What caused the change?
Yeah, many reasons, but it's a conglomeration of reasons. It's mainly to do with this precession thing. Let me pronounce them right. The Milokovic theory, which is quite correct. Scientists began to realize in the 1920s that the precessional time kind of matched climatic changes, and it's not surprising. The changes in motions of the Earth, the tilt changes and so forth, combine to cause these breakups of ice ages and so forth. So there's a kind of more or less general cycle going about 20,000 years up and down. We're due for one. We're beginning to sense some changes with volcanic eruptions and strange earthquakes here and there. There is change happening. It's basically our planet that is slowly taking a position that causes this shift. So, yeah, these things happen. They've happened many times. They've happened we can trace it back to 100,000 years with, bores that we've taken in the oceans and so forth. We can measure these changes. One of the places that gives us a very good indication is the Sahara, mainly because we know the Sahara had these climatic changes, and you do find these layers of change. They've been putting bores. So yes, the Sahara changed hands, if you like. It became fertile, arid. The phase I'm talking about is the last humid phase, and then finally super arid as we see it now. Literally, they were forced to move. You just could not find water anymore, and the natural movement was towards the Nile. They probably knew of the Nile themselves. We find evidence of some communication.
And do you think these are perhaps like the flood myth, which persists throughout many cultures?
Yeah, I think that what we're finding is which wasn't done before in archaeology. We begin to take the myths much more seriously. I think the vehicle for information in those times were myths, heavily embellished and storytelling and so forth. But the essence is there.
Indeed.
Stories of climatic change. The Quran, for example, speaks of climatic changes. They speak of the desert being fertile and stuff like that. So we have this mythical, but it's very difficult to use them as dating instruments.
Oh, naturally, no.
But the other thing is astronomy. And to me, astronomy is the tool, mainly because these people did astronomy, or rather observed and aligned. So astronomy is the tool. I mean, we have it all over the world. So to me, astronomy is the tool that was missing in the toolkit of archaeologists. It's beginning to be picked up.
And do you think that these discoveries that continue to be made, do they still allow room for the concept of an evolved antediluvian society that has been set back to the Stone Age?
I'm very convinced that we had except I want to be careful what we're trying to imagine. I mean, this Atlantis and vehicles flying, all this is not my thing. I think we had a very sophisticated, prehistorical civilization that saw the world very differently. And therefore, because we're not finding what we consider traces of civilization, like sophisticated instruments and so forth, we think they were primitives. They were not. They were in a sense the opposite of us. They didn't sort of expand and multiply. They kept in very concentrated groups, and there was clearly a lot of knowledge being accumulated there over thousands of years. So yeah, they were a civilization, but a civilization not as we imagine it. So I'm very convinced that we had sophisticated cultures that we're beginning now to sense their presence. I mean, like this Sahara culture. Until 1926, we had no idea it was there. And we know very little of it other than the artwork we're finding, the stone circles that were left. But slowly, we're beginning to sense that not only they were much more sophisticated, they spread around a lot. These people moved around vast distances. The pharaohs, even the pharaohs moved 700 kilometers in the desert. I can tell you, 700 kilometers in the desert is quite an adventure.
That must have been very exciting.
Yeah, when you think that they were using camel, well, they didn't even have the camel, they were using the donkey. We actually have drawings of them moving around. So to me, we're not understanding that they were far more capable of moving great distances. They had worked out how to move by navigation. And I'm not surprised that we're finding traces of the same ideologies in Malta, in Tenerife, in Mallorca, on mainland Greece. We're finding this evidence in Crete. It's there. What seems to be sort of ghosting out slowly from the landscape is what I would call a megalithic culture that seems to be very well spread, that lasted for thousands of years and were quite satisfied in the way they were running things.
And do you think they were intentionally interconnected, or there's just a happenstance of evolution and the spread of cultures?
We're guessing at this stage, but the evidence suggests that they were doing the same thing, and therefore there must have been interconnections. I mean, when you find that they were observing the same constellations, that they were moving the same kind of stones, that they left the same kind of drawings, we even find the same kind of symbols. So I don't know why we're so blocked into thinking that ancient prehistoric cultures could not move around. There is new work done by people like Christopher Knight and Alan Butler. We're finding, through another line of study, which I find very interesting, the megalithic yard, for example. They're using measurements. Well, one of the funny things about this megalithic yard, which I wasn't aware of, for example, is the precision that you find of the measurement in various sites. Now, we know now that in order to find that kind of precision, you must have certain tools, because if you use wood or strings or whatever, you just can't reproduce this precision. We find this the same thing in Egypt, that they were able to reproduce measurements to fractions of an inch. So what were they using? And we're beginning to suspect that they were actually using the stars. They were actually measuring in the sky and reproducing them on the ground, rather than taking rulers and so forth.
So the megalithic yard and the pyramid inch have similar roots then?
I think that what we have is a culture that used the sky for its knowledge base, and not just to measure and have a lines, but they were actually using it as a language. And therefore we're kind of reading this language now. We're beginning to sense that they left us, or they left themselves messages. They wrote their history in stellar stone alignments, if you like.
Do you think that they were sufficiently cognizant of their own legacy, if you like, to be leaving intentional messages for us, for their descendants?
I'm very convinced this of the Egyptians. Whether it applies to other cultures, I still haven't gone there. But it's very evident that the Egyptian, it begs this. I mean, finally we have hieroglyphs, but the hieroglyphs talk about stars and so forth. What was missing in Egyptological study was to marry the architecture with the text and with astronomy. Once you put them together, suddenly you get information.
So why do you think there's such reticence then amongst Orthodox Egyptology to ignore the king list, for instance, beyond a certain point?
Well, one of the reticences is that there is a consensus to what the history is. And to budge this consensus is quite hard, I can tell you. I've been among those who have hit this dam. And I'm a great believer that it can be done. There is a huge intellectual resistance, there's no doubt. But it can be done, but it must be done in a certain way. It must be done according to the rules of debate here. It's a bit like the elections we're having now in the... Who's Prime Minister, by the way?
And, like it makes a difference. But
it doesn't make a difference. No, I use this as an example because you can only win an election according to the rules.
Indeed.
And you can only win at this culture game according to the rules. And I think a lot of those who are trying to do that are not doing the right thing. I mean, I know their intentions are good, but I've taken a different route. I'm staying within the arena where the battle is going on. And, you know, although they are skeptical, although there is resistance, they're nonetheless scientists, they're nonetheless intelligent people. And if you actually bring them with their back against the wall, like, for example, the star alignments of pyramids. I mean, 20 years ago, it was kind of almost heretical to talk about stars and pyramids. Now it's fully there. I mean, the alignment of the shafts of the Great Pyramid, the alignment of to certain constellations. Studies are being made by the Antiquity Department about temple alignment. So it's become kosher. The reason being is that people like us have brought it to a point where it was a kind of checkmate. You had to accept it. The evidence was overwhelming. So I think this is how to approach it. And slowly, we're going to do it. There is going to be a shift in understanding our past. I think the big error is that we've given names to situations. We say history, prehistory. I don't see it like that anymore. There is a continuous line.
I think that's a very important distinction. Yeah,
and to remove those barriers, to start moving further in time. I mean, once we say history, then people don't want to study prehistory, if you see what I mean.
So, given the what we've talked about alignments and about the stars and the sun and the moon, why do you imagine that so many disparate sites all over the earth, we're talking about the Americas, we're talking about Africa, we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, Michael Tellinger's made some certain discoveries there, in Europe, in China, all over the place. Why do you suppose there are such similarities? Is there an alternate hypothesis other than a common parent culture?
Well, if I want to stay within what academics today would probably accept and probably believe, well, we're all the same human beings, and we're going to be influenced by the same things. And I think one of the things that, I mean, if it's very hard to put yourself in that context, but if you really try and put yourself in a situation where there is no science, there is no knowledge that the planet is a globe, there is no roads, there is no cities, there is to try and make sense of your existence. The first thing you start looking in a very mysterious way is the motions of the, and then you begin to pick up certain things. This thing sets here, I'll mark it. The sun rises here but moves there. It forces you to count the annual cycle. You begin to realize that certain constellations appear in spring and others appear in autumn. So it kind of stimulates you to work out certain things. And since we're all under the same sky, I'm very, very convinced that things like geometry, well, science emerges from this kind of observation. So it's observation by different people. Now, The variety is that they lived in different geographical conditions. So, for example, the Nile people were very much influenced by certain constellations because of the cycles of the flood. They became very quickly aware of astronomical directions because of the Nile. It's north and south. In Egypt, you're constantly aware of the compass points because you're in a land that has a river that goes north and south. Others had it slightly different. So they developed, but basically the same stimulus is there. So I'm not surprised that the architecture is more or less the same, the ideology is more or less the same, but either evolving in a slightly different format or at different times.
So that's that. I think you're absolutely right. I don't think we're ever going to completely negate the idea of the common culture theory until it's either proven or disproven conclusively one way or the other.
Well, I'm sorry, I wanted to say this. I mean, we are in fact from a common source. We know that we sprang all from Africa. The question is whether there was a knowledge that moved around or whether the knowledge was independently discovered. I believe that it's a mixture of a lot of things. I mean, it's too much of a coincidence, for example, to develop the bow and arrow in various places. I mean, to me, it's odd that we come up with the same ideas. And we do find, by the way, I didn't show them, but in these primitive people, we actually have drawings with them with bows and arrows.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic.
So, it's one of those things that clearly it passed on. It wasn't one of those things that somebody said, I'll take a thing and bow it. Things like the making of beer, for example. There is a common thread, I'm sure, that passed on. Now, how it passed on, maybe through myths, maybe through storytelling, maybe through physical contact, I don't know. There is definitely a common thread, but there is also that same stimulus. Climate forces us to react the same way. I mean, if you're in a cold climate, you're going to try and cover yourself. If you're in a hot climate, you're going to try and have shelter. So these are the things that are stimulus from the geographical and climatic conditions, and others may have passed through a physical thread. So it's a mixture of all.
I wanted to talk very briefly about the physical end of megalith construction. You're an engineer by trade, if I remember correctly. We're talking in some cases of blocks of stone that are tens of tons in weight in Egypt, carried from Aswan. You look at Baalbek in the Lebanon, 200 tons, some of these. How do you imagine they went about it? These are challenging feats even today.
I was telling somebody downstairs that actually we're talking hundreds of tons, not dozens of tons. I mean, many people may not be aware, but the Great Pyramid, although built on average with limestone blocks of about 2 tons, we have, even in the limestone construction, we have about 15, 20 tons. But the King's Chamber, for example, is built of granite, black granite brought from Aswan. Not only the travel distance, we're talking about 600 kilometers distance, but some of the blocks are up to 6 to 70 tons. The quarrying, transportation, and the lifting to about 50, 60 meters in height I frankly don't know. We've had engineers. I've had some of the top engineers. I was involved with the late Jean Carissel, who was one of France's top engineers. Worked at the pyramid for many years. My brother is an architect. He's been very much involved with the study of pyramids. The honest answer is we're baffled. The pyramids are impressive enough, I mean, because of their size, but we have temples around the pyramids, and they use blocks of on average, about 150 tons. I don't know if you get the idea of what 150 tons is. It's taking, let me get this right, about 200 family cars and squishing them together. Not just the sheer weight of moving, the effort required to move the sheer weight, but what we're baffled is why. I mean, why would they use 200-ton blocks or 150-ton blocks to build a temple? It's as if we just don't get it. I mean, to me, that's the big question. I've always been in the why thing. I mean, to be honest, as a construction engineer, my answer is I don't know. I mean, we can explain certain things, but I really don't know how some people without the technology, without even the pulley, without the wheel, by the way, in the Old Kingdom, we don't think they had a wheel. In fact, without anything, could move blocks of that size, lift them to heights of 146 meters. I just don't know. I mean, I wouldn't even dare think of doing this myself with modern technology. I mean, so the honest answer is we don't know. And I know there's many theories and dragging the stones. The thing is, it's a bit like archaeoastronomy. You have many people doing paperwork theories until you go out there on the field and try to align something to the stars, and you realize how difficult it is. You know, I've had arguments with my theory, you know, where they're saying, well, you know, it's 2 arc minutes in error. You try and get 2 arc minutes measurements with the naked eye, and it's just impossible. So, moving, you know, you have archaeologists saying, well, they drag the stones and they put them on sledges and so forth. It doesn't work for me. I mean, I've actually seen I've actually seen trucks trying to move 5-ton blocks. And it's quite an operation. I mean, just one block.
I watched 2 or 3 years ago Professor Mark Lerner.
Well, I know Mark very well. Mark is the first one who got a big surprise with this, you know.
Because he tried to carry out a reconstruction, did he not?
Yeah. They tried to build a pyramid which was 12 meters high, and they gave up at the end. Simply because the workers just could not do it. And they finally had to bring a forklift truck. I mean, they just couldn't do it. It's one of those things that I'm always baffled with Egyptologists. I mean, forget a 150-ton block, even a 2-ton block. I mean, it's quite a job. I mean, it's just very difficult to imagine not just moving these blocks, but producing the precision that they managed to do with the pyramids, for example. I mean, they built a monument that's 220 meters square, sides with squares of 220 meters, a height of 46 meters. They managed to not only align it to within 3 arc minutes of precision, but they maintained the slope accurately to 146 meters. Now, I can tell you that as a construction engineer, I would have difficulty, even with modern instruments, not just to mark the precision of the slope, but to actually maintain the construction at that accuracy. They did it. It's there. It's baffling.
And there's also the aspect that the slope is 51 degrees, I believe, on the Great Pyramid.
5150.
5150.
Yeah, it's almost 52.
And each of the sides also has a slight concave.
That's another thing. Yeah, the sides. I mean, it's not visibly seen, but they do have about. I think it's about half a meter, but because of 220 meters, you hardly notice it. Yeah, it's another odd one. I think one of the things that's most baffling that is rarely raised, apart from the size of the stone, apart from the precision, is the fact that there is 203 courses in the Great Pyramid, using the Great Pyramid as an example, and none of the courses are of the same height, and none of the blocks are of the same length. Now, there is 2.5 million blocks approximately to build a pyramid. Now, I'll give you an idea, because the house we're in now, it's a typical maisonette. You probably have about 60,000 bricks. Now, can you imagine building this house with 60,000 bricks that are not of the same size? You drive the builder mad. I mean, he'd go crazy. The question is, why did they do this? I mean, if I was to build a pyramid today, I would want to standardize my blocks. You know, they deliver the blocks, and I know which one goes on which course. And so these are the mechanics, the administrative mechanics of a building project that Egyptologists simply don't understand. To prepare and plan a pyramid site, just one pyramid site, and we have about 25 of them, would require years of preparation today. I would require a labor force of about 8,000 to 10,000 people. Now, just the idea of having that many people on a building project would require housing, drainage, how to feed them, how to service them. In itself, it's a nightmare. So all these things are ignored. I mean, the Egyptologists say they pull the blocks, they put them up. It's not so in a building project. The plans and the documents required to build just this house would be about that size. You would have specifications, you have building instructions, you have drawings, all this stuff, instruments. For a pyramid project, to plan it in terms of labor, the quarries, who will deliver, and so forth, I would fill a room with documents today.
And that's before we even get into...
Before we put the first stone.
And that's before we even get into the issue of, for instance, the shafts have not been cut once it's in. They've been built in each course, have they not?
That's right.
So when you take that into account, when you take into account the gigantic size of the component blocks, the fact that none of them are the same size, the fact that they align to within 3 minutes of arc to the cardinal points, and that we can't replicate this today, or not without a great deal of thinking and machinery, are we not then forced to rethink what we think we know about?
Right, and you're hitting the nail on the head here. The trouble is that we've been given a context by Egyptologists, by historians, and we're trying to fit the evidence into this context, and it's beginning not to be clear that we can't fit it in. You know, the context is we're looking at people who didn't have the wheel, didn't have the pulley, they didn't have iron, they didn't have bronze, they had no lifting devices, they didn't know geometry, they didn't have optical instruments. So we're trying to fit it, and it doesn't fit. For example, the operation of alignment. As a surveyor, I did building survey, so it isn't. I mean, you read in geological books, well, they align them to the stars. Well, okay. First, you have to get to know where true north is. You have to work out true north. Where today, even astronomers will have trouble because many of them, because it's already mapped. But start from scratch, and what you'd have to do is you'd have to observe the stars. You have to work out the transit of a star at meridian. It's a whole process, let me tell you. An astronomer will take about 4 days to establish true north with the precision. After that, you have to transfer that on the ground. And once you've transferred the line on the ground, you have to get those 2-ton blocks and put them in 220 meters to maintain that precision. Now, they maintained it at 3 arc minutes. So to start with this, and the various operations today, I would expect at least half a degree error. They got 3 arc minutes. Now, to get that, you have today, I mean, I have trouble without optical instruments. I mean, if I would phone a contractor, I would say, listen, I'm crazy enough, but I want to build a pyramid 146 meters high, and I want it with a base of 220 meters. You know, you'd quickly work it out and said, well, you want it in stone, the calculation is very simple, it's going to need 6 million tons of stone. So already that's a huge problem. Then I say I want it within 3 arc minute precision. And it says, well, okay, it's going to be tough, but I can do it. And then I say, okay, but here's the deal. I don't want to use trucks, I don't want to use lorries, I don't want to use lifting equipment, I don't want to use tools, I don't want to use pulleys, I don't want to use the wheel. What is he going to tell me?
Find somebody else.
It says, let's call an ambulance, I'll have you carted away. I mean, it just doesn't work. And, you know, we're trying to please the academics, we're trying to fit it in, and it doesn't.
There will come a point then. There must come a point.
I think we got the model wrong. I mean, the simple answer is that the context is wrong. We're dealing with people who are far more sophisticated, who are much more able and capable than we think, and we just don't give them the credit. I mean, the evidence is there, and we're trying to fit them through a keyhole that doesn't pass.
Do you think we're ever going to find the smoking gun? Are we ever going to find the one piece of evidence?
There's a lot of people working on this. I mean, there's a lot of serious people. And there's more and more of the academics who are changing camps a bit. The problem with Egyptology is that it's declared itself a scientific body. And the problem there is that you're dealing with clearly a people who, although used technology, they thought in a very different way, and we have to start thinking metaphysically. I mean, I'll be the last to say this, but it's true. There's nothing more useless than a pyramid, if we think it in terms of today. But it is extremely useful if you think in terms of the culture that did it. It has a function, but the function is so alien to us that we simply can't get it. It's what we were talking during the conference. There is a different way of looking at our presence on this planet. And we become so externalized to try and understand it that we forget that we are the mysterious thing. We are the cosmos. We're the cosmos taken consciousness here. And we've stopped looking at ourselves in this way, whereas the ancients did. And therefore they begin to make sense when you look at these monuments, when you start thinking in those terms. So that's the problem with Egyptology, is that it's kind of, I mean, until recently it was kind of taboo not to speak about astronomy, for example. I felt very uncomfortable talking about star alignments. It's beginning to be okay now. I use the example of talking about civilizations in the cosmos. I mean, until recently, if you talked about this, you were branded Eric von Daniken and you were insulted and all this. Well, it's now become kosher. I mean, National Geographic discusses it, and because the evidence does not fit the model that we're presented. It's like the climatic conditions of the Sahara. We're given a climatic condition, it's very obvious. I mean, the drawings simply show it. It wasn't always arid.
No.
So we have to think differently.
And as a truly scientific, if it is a truly scientific body, if Egyptology or archaeology per se is truly scientific, it has to look at data even if it doesn't fit the model.
Exactly. I mean, what science is really all about is not creating a model and sticking to it, is to adjust this model because the evidence demonstrated. The model of Egyptology that is presented to us does not fit. The pyramid builders, let alone what we're finding in the Sahara now, does not fit the model they gave us. We cannot conclude that we're looking at people that were incapable of doing simple mathematics, and then we see the evidence that clearly we're looking at people who were able to not only work out mathematical problems, but they were able to survey, they were able to maintain accuracy. Just the organization, we're running out of time here, but let me just conclude with one thing that needs to be said here. I talked to once a general, a military general, who came from the States, and he was part of our tour. And he said, do you know what? I've been looking at these monuments. Now, this man understood what it is organizing a large number of people. And he said, how long did it take to build? So I said, we don't know, but we think 20 years. And he said, I don't know how I would maintain an organization for 20 years. We can't even maintain a government for 4 years. To build a monument of this kind would require one hell of an organization, and to maintain it, and to finally finish the monument with the accuracy that we see over 20, 25 years, perhaps more, over 2 generations perhaps, requires one hell of an organization. That alone is indicating that we're dealing with far, far more sophisticated people than we think.
Abdel Latif and other
writers, yes.
Writers from the scholastic period of the Great Arab Renaissance, if you like, speak of a legendary time, if you like, when the Great Pyramids were covered in white Tura limestone with the inscriptions that nobody understood, that are long since gone, and that some of these even had a high watermark on them. Is there a possibility? Is there even room to consider what some would possibly still imagine as a fairy tale, that when this great people that you discovered
were much older,
and they came out of the desert to dynastic or pre-dynastic Egypt and found the pyramids there waiting for them? Is that even conceivable?
Well, I'm going to say what Professor Edwards says. It's not impossible. But I'll tell you what we're beginning to think. And I'm saying we, there's a group of people like myself, Robert Schock, Hancock, John West, people who have been there studying this for a long time. What is becoming clearer and clearer with Giza in particular, Giza is the centerpiece of all this, is that we're looking at 2 phases. It's very obvious that we're looking at what we're beginning to call a megalithic phase, the large, big block phase, which not only are using a different type of construction, it's very obvious when you begin to see it this way, but the stones look much older. So we're looking at an earlier phase, maybe, who knows, thousands of years before, the Sphinx, for example. And we're looking at what we call a pyramid age phase. It's quite possible that either the bases or there was something there that the pyramids or the construction was completed. It's not impossible. And so my answer to your question is I wouldn't go as far as saying that the pyramids were there when the Egyptians went there, but I would say that something was there. And what that something is, we're kind of chasing it now. I suspect that there was a pre-pharaonic culture that left its traces, and that the pharaohs knew about it. And that as the technology began to develop, they began to add to it. It seems to be the case. Giza smells of this, mainly because of the work of Robert Schoch and the geology. But many people don't know this, but the Great Pyramid is actually built on a mound.
Yes, I'm aware of that, and the bottom courses were built in, I believe. Is this correct?
The mound is, well, the mound is 7 meters high. Now, 7 meters is about 2.5 times the height of the ceiling. It's a big mound to leave. Now, Egyptologists say the stupidest thing. They say that the mound was left because it saved them labor. It's the craziest thing from an engineering point of view. You're going to build a 6 million ton monument. Now, the thing about this mound, and in fact where the pyramid stands, it's in fact dangerously near to the escarpment. There is an escarpment there. It's about 70 meters for an escarpment. No engineer today would take the risk of building a 6 million ton monument that close to an escarpment, unless he was damn sure that it would stand. We would have 200% tests, soil test, borehole test. And even then, we would say we probably won't take the risk. We'd push it another 200 meters away from the escarpment. So it looks like they knew that it would stand. That in itself is a big question. Why they left the mound is a big question, because as an engineer, I would not put a building of that weight on uneven ground. It's like building this house on a pile of rocks. You want the ground nice and flat. I mean, and I would either move the monument and build it somewhere flat, or I would cut the mound. And this is crazy stuff. I mean, to leave a mound and build a monument of this size. So there was something there that needed to be kept there. The mound is an indication. We begin to think that the subterranean chamber was an ancient chamber. There's clearly something that happened there thousands of years before. I'll go as far as that.
Robert Bauval, thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Megalithomania.